All right. For those of you who are curious but too polite to ask, I broke my kneecap in August. They take a long time to heal. So what I want to do today is talk to you about robotics. I could talk for a week about robotics, but they told me I've only got 25 minutes, so I'm going to go quickly and just try and hit you with some high-level perspectives of robotics as I see them and how they fit into some of the big problems that we face as a society, as a global society today. I was a kid in the 1960s, and I grew up with robots and television. These characters are probably familiar to you. The robot from Lost in Space, Jaime, Rosie, the maid. If you play word association games with people today and you say robot, they're probably going to mention these guys. They're probably the most widely known robots on the planet. Well, actually, they don't exist. But the problem as a roboticist that we face is that people expect from robotics a level of competency that they see on the screen, on television, and in Hollywood movies that we cannot yet create. So it's the beacon on the hill. That's what we're aiming for, but we're not there yet. We've got a long way to go. And of course, there are many, many other movies with robots. Every few years, another robot movie comes out. It's interesting, the word robot itself came from a Czech play way back in 1921. That's a long, long time ago. It was coined by a guy, Karl Čapek, in a play called Rossum's Universal Robots. He's Czech, and when I was in Prague a few years ago, I made a pilgrimage to Čapek's grave, and there it is, the picture down in the bottom, and someone's put a little robot on it, which I thought was rather sweet, and I wished I'd thought of that myself. But the plot of this play from 1921 is that human beings make robots, and robot is a Czech word for worker, to ease the burden of daily life. The robots get uppity and they kill the human beings. Right? We've heard this plot over and over again. It's been recreated, different characters. It's the perennial plot of robots in fiction. So we're kind of used to these the fictional robots, and you've got little R2-D2, who's an incredibly useful guy to have when you're in a pinch. But the sad thing is that it's a little man in a can. It's English actor Kenny Baker. For certainly a lot of the early Star Wars movies, it was Kenny inside R2-D2. And really the only connection Kenny Baker's got to robotics is I got the same birthday. True fact. The other thing when people think about robots is they think about this visual model. These are the robots that are hard at work in manufacturing. They're welding cars, they're doing spray painting and whatever. And there are a lot of these robots on the planet. It's hard to get hard numbers of this, but one report I saw recently said there were 8 million robots on the planet, 7 million industrial robots like this, another million of what's called service robots. At the moment, they're mostly toys and vacuum cleaners. It's the population of Austria. That's how many robots there are on the planet right now. And you look at population growth, it's exponential. So robots are coming. So this technology, the industrial robots that we have in factories, is now quite an old technology, actually surprisingly old. And it comes from this little company based in Connecticut in the US called Humanoid Inc. It was founded by two guys, George Duval at the top, who died just last year, aged 99, an inveterate inventor, and Joe Engelberger, the guy at the bottom wearing the bow tie, who was the entrepreneur. They were the Wozniak and Jobs of their day, right? The guy who had the deep technical knowledge, which was Duval, Engelberger, who was just tireless in proselytizing and boosting robotics. He had robots on the Johnny Carson show. He got robots really introduced into Japan. It was Joe Engelberger's energy and push that made that happen. And eventually it was the Asian robotics industries that eclipsed the United States robotics industry with respect to industrial robots. So this first robot they installed to unload die casting machines in a GM plant in 1956. It predated the images that I showed you right at the beginning, Lost in Space, Get Smart, the Jetsons and whatever. It's a very, very old technology now, and a lot of people don't realize how old it is. A lot of the manufacturing robots today are involved in assembling printed circuit boards. They're involved in the electronic industry. So here's a very high-speed robot, which is basically taking chips from a loader, from a reel, and placing them very, very accurately onto a circuit board. Here's another industrial robot, and all it's doing is taking boxes off a conveyor belt and putting them into a larger box. It's palletizing. So a lot of the robot jobs are just like this, and if I had to characterize them in some way, I'd say a robot, very simplistically, is a machine that can move something from A to B. And you can do it tirelessly. You can do it very reliably, very accurately, over and over again, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's the beauty of a robot. Doesn't need to have the lights on, it can work in the dark, doesn't make mistakes, it doesn't have a dog that can die and ruin its day, right? So that's what robots do. They move things from A to B. But we can lift this up a scale. So in a container port, right, a robot is something that moves things from A to B. Now it's a container. So the port of Brisbane, if you probably see that as you fly into Brisbane on the north side of the approach, is a fully automated port. There are big robots that are lifting the containers off the quayside and putting them onto the container stacks, taking them off the container stacks and putting them onto trucks. It's a brilliant development, an Australian development in automated container handling. So it's a really good task for a robot. It's not too much different to the previous one. It's a box, it's just a much, much bigger box. But robots actually have many, many different shapes and many functions. So here's a snapshot of some of my favorite robots. So there's an underwater robot, the thing at the top that looks like a UFO. There's the blimp robot, which was designed for surveying rainforests in South America. There's Aerosonde, which is a locally developed robot for doing meteorological surveys. So it's a robot that can fly. And the one in the bottom right is a weird one from Carnegie Mellon University that used legs and could rappel down into the crater of a volcano to make measurements of gases and whatever. It's an environment that's way too hazardous to put people into, but you'd happily put a robot into there. So in the early days of robotics, we talked a lot about jobs that we considered to be dirty, dull, and dangerous. We thought that these are jobs that human beings should not do. And human beings actually vote with their legs and choose not to do jobs that are dirty, dull, and dangerous. The robots would replace people in these roles. And the initial ones were in manufacturing, wrestling great big spot welding guns, doing spray painting. But actually there's a lot of dirty, dull, and dangerous jobs outside of manufacturing, out in the real world. And here are some lists of fatality rates for some very important industries: agriculture, mining, transportation, construction, and so on. So although this manufacturing robot has its origins back in 1956, in the last 2 decades there's been a lot of work on robots for these kind of what we call field applications, the field of field robotics. And if we look at just mining for a moment, because I spent more than a decade of my life considering mining robotics, you could say that, just look at the figures here. 100 years ago in coal mining in the United States, they were killing 200,000 to 300,000 workers a year. That was the annual fatality rate. And you look at the learning curve here, you look at how the absolute number of fatalities has reduced over time. But notice that it hasn't got to zero. And it will probably never get to zero while there are human beings involved in the mining process itself. And so there's a lot of interest in the mining industry to use robots, remove the last few human beings that are involved in these very dangerous processes, get them out of there, and get that fatality rate down to zero. The pie chart shows some more recent data and shows the breakup of how people are killed in mining in the United States. And it's not all about being crushed by falling rocks. It's a lot about getting tangled up with machinery, big powerful machines, human beings. It's not a good combination, particularly in the close confines proximity that exists within the mining industry. So there's been a big push in the mining industry, a lot of investment in how can we use robotic technology, how can we apply that, move it from the manufacturing industry where it grew up into new domains. So if you go back to that sort of simple, a robot is a machine that moves stuff from A to B analogy. Here's a dragline excavator, and I spent too many years of my life on a dragline. But basically what it does is moves overburden from A to B on the top of a spoil pile, 100 and something tons at a time in a bucket. And you could automate this. You could automate the dragline so it moves bucket after bucket all by itself as quickly as possible with the minimum amount of stress and damage to the machine. And we've demonstrated that that was possible. Almost a decade ago, we demonstrated that it was possible. Here is current mining practice, haul truck moving overburden or ore from one place to another. It's moving it from A to B. That's a robotic task. You don't need to have somebody driving that truck. In underground mining, what you're doing is moving material from the stope to an ore pass using a machine like a load haul dump unit. And we developed technology in Cyro that does that automatically and was licensed to Caterpillar. So a lot of the way we've considered the problems of robotics is to tackle problems that are dirty, dull, and dangerous. And we've looked at it on an industry by industry or function by function basis. But over the last few years, I've been thinking about this, and I think we're kind of missing the big picture. And what I want to do today is sort of try the big picture idea on you and see how it works. So here are three pretty interesting graphs. Right? The top one is the world population projection from the United Nations for three models, the low growth, the medium growth, and the high growth model. We're already at 7 billion people. Now you can see if we keep going at high growth or even median growth, we're going to have a considerably greater number of the people on the planet by 2050. The next graph is a really interesting one. It's called dependency ratio. It is the number of people who are dependent, children and old people, over the number of working age people. So children plus over 65s, over 19 to 64s. And you can see that it's pretty low at the moment. It's about 0.65. So for every worker here, you are supporting 0.65 dependent people. By 2100, you will be supporting just over one dependent person. The dependency ratio is going to change massively. This is a demographic bowl that so many people are concerned about. And I'm going to talk a bit more detail about each of these graphs and how that meshes with robotics. The bottom graph, I guess, probably well known if you saw the Al Gore movie. He needed a cherry picker to reach the top of the graph. Here it's much smaller. But it's the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere from the 1950s when it was first started to be recorded. And you can see the annual cycle, basically tree growth in the northern hemisphere. And you can see it's going inexorably upwards. So what's the message from this? A lot more people on the planet, a lot more dependent people on the planet, right? The ratio of workers to dependent people is going in a worse direction, and there's going to be some serious changes to the environment on the planet. So let's look at the world population graph. We'll go through them one by one. There are reports from the United Nations and many other bodies that say we need to produce something like 70% more food by 2050. There's not going to be a whole lot more land opened up. In fact, land is under pressure for a whole lot of different reasons. Water is under pressure for a whole lot of different reasons. So we're going to have to be pretty smart if we want to be able to make this big lift in food production by 2050. It's not that far away. The year-on-year growth is pretty extreme. All those more bodies on the planet are going to need more resources. They're going to need more energy. They're going to need more minerals, to produce the mobile phones and refrigerators and cars that they require, the petrol to put in the fuel tanks or whatever. And it's going to be a whole lot more stuff moving around. There's going to be more people moving around. There's going to be a lot more material and food and other things moving around. So transportation and congestion is going to be a really big problem into the future. You can already see it now in China, which is completely mad. I visited China 12 years ago, and it was mostly bicycles. And then I went back there a year ago, and it was mostly cars and motorbikes. And the number I heard was if they have 80 cars per 1,000 people, we have 2,000 cars per 1,000 people, they have 80, and it's already mad. So they're going to have to do something very different. So let's kick off just with a bit of discussion about transport. Here's an interesting graph, and you probably know this in your bones. This is a graph of traffic density versus traffic flow. And as the traffic density increases, it's nice, the flow goes up linearly for a while, and then it peaks, you get a sweet spot, and then it goes down. So the more traffic you have, the more cars per kilometre, the actual flow rate falls down. And you know that, right? You get jammed in traffic. And this is a really big problem. So Google have been doing a lot of work on developing an autonomous car. So this is the Google car, or a prototype of the Google car. You say, why are Google doing cars? Well, what they know is that you can change that curve. If the cars are autonomous and they platoon, so this graph is, this blue line shows what the road capacity would be if the cars drove themselves instead of being driven by people. But 90% of people think that they're above average drivers, right? The sad news is that most people are rubbish drivers. And to accommodate the fact that they're rubbish drivers, we need to have large gaps in between the cars. If the cars were smart and drove with a meter gap, and they could do that, with precision computer control, we could do massive things to road congestion. That's why Google's interested in cars. In a few years' time, you'll be able to run a car running Android. Buy a car running Android, yeah. So that's what and that's what robotics is. This is robotic technology. This technology that Google are developing came out of the DARPA robot grand challenges. So DARPA ran a number of competitions to look at the efficacy of robot vehicles. And they've taken that technology and they're running with it faster than anyone else on the planet right now. Food. This 70% increase in food production by 2050. We need to achieve that, despite things like the farmer demographic statistics, which I'll show in a moment, things like weed resistance. So some of the most effective way to do farming today is not to turn the soil up with plows. You basically try and disturb the soil as little as possible, and you apply herbicide to remove the weeds. You do chemical weeding, and that's really the best way to do farming today. Problem is the weeds are becoming resistant to that approach, and that's a really big problem we need to deal with. Available land is getting less. We have other uses for land compete with farming, particularly urban growth. And there's climate change, and we don't quite know what that's going to do for farming. So let's look at the demographics. Farmers are an old population and getting older. That was rapidly aging for the last decade or so. It's begun to stabilise, but they're an old bunch. There are not enough young people going into farming. Resistant weeds. So the graph at the top shows the number of resistant weeds to all the different kind of herbicides that are out there as a function of time, and the bottom graph shows the geographic distribution of resistant weeds. So just as we've done with antibiotics, and we've caused the rise of superbugs and golden staph and all of these things, by hitting weeds with herbicides, they have evolved a resistance to the herbicides. So the most environmentally benign herbicides are becoming less effective over time. So we need to hit them with more and more toxic chemicals. They cost a lot more, and they do much more damage to the environment. So we need to be very careful about this. We need to kill them well with the herbicides that are effective and apply the most lethal herbicides in our arsenal in a very selective and effective way. So here's what spraying looks like on a farm today, right? So there's a number of things wrong with this picture from my perspective. First of all, there's a guy driving it. I don't know what that's about. The other thing is that the machine is very big. The reason the machine is actually very big is because there's a guy driving it. How do I increase the productivity of a man driving a machine to spray a field? I make the machine as big as possible. But there's a lot of knock-on problems, and most of them are negative. One is that the machine becomes much bigger, becomes much more expensive. The farmer can only afford to perhaps have one of them. If the machine breaks, he's got no machine. The machines are perhaps less reliable than they should be. The spray booms are very large and well above the material that they're trying to spray. So they spray somewhat indiscriminately. So the amount of herbicide that's used is very large. A lot of it gets into the environment and not onto the weed that it should be hitting. So at QT, we've got a joint project with Andrew Bate, who's in the audience somewhere today, looking at reinventing this thing and saying, well, how would we do it differently? So here's a robot attacking weeds. And yeah, it's not going to look like R2-D2. But it would be robotic, so it's got no driver. It's got no driver, it means it can operate 24/7, so we've got much more productivity. We can treat individual weeds. So we can look at a weed and say what kind of weed it is and hit it with a herbicide that's appropriate to that particular type of weed. It's probably what we did 400 years ago when people went out and tended the fields and treated plants as individuals. We don't do that anymore. We can get back to treating plants as individuals if we have robots to provide that extra labor. The machines would be smaller and lighter, so they do less soil damage. Another problem with these really big machines is they compact soil. So to get around soil compaction, what we use is GPS guidance to keep them on virtual tram lines, so they only destroy a small amount of the soil in your paddock, not all of it. So we can get around that problem as well. And but if they're small enough and cheap enough, we can deploy many of them. So we can then make peak demand. You can put 100 of them in the paddock today, and you can move them to a different paddock next week. And your overall reliability goes up. One machine goes down, you've lost 1% of your capacity rather than losing 100% of your capacity. So we see a lot of merit in this smaller, approach with smaller, multiple robots targeting weeds and plants on an individual basis. But we could get a little bit more far-fetched, and this is an artist's impression. Maybe you get around the transportation problem and the farming problem by growing plants in an urban area and having robots to tend urban plants and urban gardens, and harvesting vegetables and fruits. Maybe that's possible. Dependency ratio I talked about before, and I defined it. The bold that's highlighted there is the baby boomers, right? So the dependency ratio went down after the Second World War because all these children were born, right? So they were dependents. They entered into the denominator, which is not so good. Then they went into the workforce. So now we're at a particularly good point with respect to dependency ratio, right? But from here, it's all going to, I'm not going to say go downhill. It's actually going to go uphill on this graph. Right? And that's because the baby boomers are going to move to the numerator, right? They're going to become dependents instead of workers. Our fertility rate's gone down, and we're aging. So this is a really big problem for our time. There are less workers for every person on the planet. So we need to do something really major about productivity, and that's going to affect every sphere of life. So let's consider healthcare for a moment. So this is, shows the distribution of elective surgeries as a function of age. So for women, it's much higher when they're younger, and that's essentially childbearing. But when they get older, then everyone's in there, a lot more elective operations happening, right? But dependency ratio tells you there's going to be less surgeons, there's going to be less nurses, there's going to be less orderlies, right? We have a problem. So robotics has already started to make some inroads into surgery. So robotic surgery is quite well established. There are companies that sell robot surgical devices. They allow you to do this endoscopic surgery, so you can make much smaller holes in people, which means that they heal much more quickly. But if you go into an operating theatre, and I did a couple of years ago, I was surprised at the number of people that's in there. Okay, I get you need a surgeon. Yeah, he's got a job. Anaesthetist, you need him. But there's all these other people in there, and it was hard for me to understand quite what they were doing. Yeah, there's somebody handing tools to the surgeon, and that really happens, and then counting them out and making sure that none are left inside the patient. A machine could do that. But there's all the other functions within a hospital. A hospital is this huge material flow problem, right? There's patients going from A to B. There's meals, there's linen, there's drugs, there's specimens and lab samples, all of this stuff. There's a huge workflow, a huge flux of physical items. So we're making a lot of progress in e-health, records and whatever. It's all the physical items in a hospital we need to do work on. So this is a field of robotics called service robots. These robots that provide a direct service to human beings. And it's still in its nascent state. There's a lot more work to be done. So what progress have we made in service robots? Well, a lot of years ago we came up with the robot vacuum cleaner. And it was a bit of a novelty item for a while. I had one, but it broke. And I should get another one because I'm a roboticist. But the other form of service robots are humanoids. And in Japan, there's a huge obsession with humanoids. And for a long time, I didn't get it. Right? So companies like Honda, Toyota are dabbling also with humanoid robots. And their viewpoint is, we have a whole world built for human beings, right? So if you built machines like human beings, they could be the extra workers that would get the dependency ratio down, right? So they could get in your car and drive. You don't need a Google car. Your service robot, your humanoid robot, could get in your car and drive you somewhere, lift you in and out of bed. It could make you a meal using the utensils and the stove and all of the tools that are in your kitchen. You could use your dishwasher. So basically what we're saying is we'll make a mechanical clone of a human being and get them to improve this dependency ratio. So it's early days yet, but this has come on in leaps and bounds. And companies like Honda and Toyota are thinking big niche market. Complex electromechanical machine, so is a car. Right? Today a car is a huge mix of electromechanical gear and computers. So are these robots. These guys are tooled up to build complex systems, large numbers, sell them and service them. So that's what Japanese car manufacturers are thinking about the future. And the Japanese have got the demographic problem in spades, probably worse than anyone else on the planet. Environmental change, this is the CO2 graph. And so really what this is saying is that we've got to do some serious work to manage this most important asset we have, our planet. And any of us are involved in managing assets, we know that the three most important things with managing assets is inspection, inspection, and inspection. And so lots of effort is expended in inspecting assets, sewers, power lines, pipelines, dams, and whatever. There's a huge cost involved in that, a huge financial cost, and some of it's quite risky. So helicopters are inspecting power lines. It's a dangerous place for a helicopter to be near power lines. It could end badly. So there's been a lot of work with robots for inspection. So robots for inspecting pipes, power lines, and whatever. But when it comes to our most important asset, the planet, our technology is decidedly primitive. It's incredibly labour-intensive. And so underwater management is like that as well. So if we're trying to manage this important asset, the cost of inspection is really, really very high. And it's quite ineffective. And that means we don't have as much information as we should have to manage this asset. But a counterexample is that we can put a robot on Mars and discover that once water flowed there, right? So we could use robots to do environmental monitoring, environmental inspection. So that was the early Phoenix rover. Those of you who don't know the scale of the current rover, this is the Curiosity rover. It is a monster. That's it there, one of its brothers on Earth. So one of my colleagues at CSIRO, Matt Dunbabin, did some really interesting work with a robot boat. And he put it on Little Narang Dam and it tooled around a few times a day and measured emissions of methane and discovered, which nobody else knew, that methane emissions from water storage vary as a function of time and day. If you're trying to do greenhouse gas accounting, CH4 is 30 times worse than CO2. And so we can actually get some measures about what's being emitted from this particular dam. So we're using a robot to monitor a small aspect of our planet. Some work from QT using unmanned aerial vehicle to count dugongs in Moreton Bay. And we can make these robots essentially persistent. We put solar cells on them and they could be up there continuously making observations and reporting it back to people who care. There's a big network of floats, and CSIRO is heavily involved in the Argo float program. There's over 3,500 floats on the planet. They go up and down, measuring salinity and temperature profiles in the oceans, give us unprecedented data about what's happening in the oceans. And it's going to be really important as they warm. At QT, we have one of these gadgets, an eco-mapper, which is a device we can use to survey a block of water. So you can put it in there and you can program it and it will go through that block of water and measure all of those things and give you that information as a function of X, Y, and Z. It's an easy to deploy tool. It's a robot to measure something about the environment. Another interest of mine is what we can do with image data. So here what we've done is taken a sequence of data from cameras. This is all speeded up here, and we can process this and build a three-dimensional reconstruction of a coral reef. Coral reefs are particularly important because they're kind of the first things against the wall when climate change comes. So their health, their growth rate is really important. So you can go along and take pictures of them, but it doesn't give you any idea about size. If we can just take a sequence of images from a camera and build a detailed three-dimensional reconstruction, we can register that over time, do longitudinal studies, and see what's the volumetric growth rate of the coral reef or the volumetric decay rate. And we can do that in situ just by taking cameras, taking pictures, and processing them in the right way. So, I'm done. Take-home messages. If you leave the room with anything else, know that robots are real. Right? It's not just what you see in Hollywood movies. That they're very diverse in form and function. Right? They're not perhaps what you have imagined them to be. They can be many, many different things. And also, I think that they are perhaps part of the solution to some really important problems that we have today. Thank you.